Classes in Game Design, based on the books by George Phillies and Tom Vasel. Design elements of contemporary strategy games and contemporary perspectives in game design, both from Third Millennium Publications, http://3mpub.com/Phillies. And today, this lecture is Lecture 4, The 6 Elements of Game Creation. I'm Professor Phillies, and this is Lecture 4 of IMGD 2500, Design of Tabletop Strategy Games. The homework that was assigned, the first homework was, list all of the sorts of games that Kostikian proposes in his Vidiot philosophical comments, and tell me which of them you've played. The second was, learn how to play Puerto Rico, since we're going to be doing it in lab, propose a strategy, and try out that strategy in class. Neither of these exactly lent themselves to right versus wrong. Most of you did just fine on coming up with different sorts of games that Kostikian proposes. Some of you have played a lot of games. Some of you have played almost no games. That's very good. At least one design team is going to have someone who will look at the game design and have absolutely no prejudices as to all of the risk rules are there, because this is basically exactly like Risk. With respect to the Puerto Rico strategy, exactly one of you realized there are several other people in the world who have played Puerto Rico. Therefore, there is probably something on the internet about Puerto Rico strategy, and I should look up what it is. And they did. And the person who did this has these nice set of exclamation marks next to their yes grade, because they did something which was definitely superior to the rest of you. I mean, there is an internet out there. You really wouldn't use Google for scientific research and rely on it and nothing else. But for this sort of research, it's very good, and one of you actually figured this out and did it. With respect to the strategies, there were a lot of people who proposed what is known as the corn strategy, which is to grow corn and ship it off. This works at least until you have 3 people in the game trying the same strategy at the same time. One of you got the little note from me, I do not play the game very much, that you proposed the quarry strategy, which happens to be the one I'm fond of, and you can figure out which buildings you want to buy to follow this, starting with the construction yard, the hospice, the hacienda, and if you think of it, you can see why these are useful properties to have. And having said that, the grade on this for essentially everyone was yes, because it was not the sort of homework that you could easily get right or wrong. Okay, today we are going to discuss features of games. We did this for Puerto Rico, and I used it as an example, and we start off with something called physical style. And physical style is something. We start off with something called shape. That's much vaguer. We have something called theme. We have something called components. We have something that at various times I have called the style or the pattern of play. And we have mechanisms. And you note, I sort of drew these, so, I have to put them in some pattern. They sit at 6 corners of a hexagon and are, in a certain sense, 6 elements which we combine And when we combine them, we get a game. And if we're lucky, we get a good game. And if we are less lucky, we get something that is technically playable, but you can never persuade the playtesters to do it twice. But that is what we do when we produce a game. We take these various elements, each of which has different pieces, and we put them together and we get a game. Now, am I sure there are really 6 elements? Well, I'd say yes, except last year when I gave the same lecture, there were 5 elements, and now there are 6. And I make no promises what would happen if you sat through this lecture next year. Nonetheless, that is what we do, what we put together to assemble a game. Now, having said there are 6 elements, I'll say a few general words about each of them. The physical style is you stand there and look at it for a few moments and you say, for example, this is a live-action role-playing event. Or, those are toy soldiers. This is miniatures. And we can go down the list. Pattern of play. You saw a pattern of play in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is a progress game. You experience a certain segment of time in some general sense, and each of you experience the same segment, and you see what you did with it. Something that looks a lot like a progress game and isn't is a racing game, like horse racing. And you see which horse crosses the finish line first, or second, or third. Then down here are mechanisms. And mechanisms are things like gears and cams and transistors and, whatever, that you all assemble together. And some things are more important, like gears. And some things are really unusual, like coherers. You can ask an electrical engineer, a very old electrical engineer, what a coherer is. But they're still mechanisms. They're parts. Now on the other side here, we have elements that are actually somewhat more vague. Shape. Shape is what the game occupies of your life. We'll make that more precise when we talk about it. Theme. This is going to be a game about pirates. Except space is very popular. So this is going to be a game about space pirates in helmets. Well, one of the things you run into if you have people who do not know anything about game design is they say, I'm going to design a game, and they go on about the theme at great length, and at some point you realize there is no game here. There is someone enthusing about graphical elements or link-ups with media for some book or whatever. But theme is not game. Not at all. It's like someone saying, I am going to write a novel about, and instead of giving you the plot of the great Soviet novel, I did that in Lecture 1, remember? They say, it's a book about pirates! There is no novel there. Pirates is not a novel. You need a plot. And finally, there are components. And components are the things that make this work. And if you're clever, you use components that embody the theme and capture to some extent the imagination of the player. Well, unless you're playing Go, in which case the components are a square grid of lines and round objects of 2 colors. So, those are the 6 elements we combine to form a game. Having said we have 6 elements that we combine to form a game, I am now going to talk in considerably more detail about only one of them. And today I am going to talk about physical style. Now, Kostikian already does this, and as you have now read both of his wonderful essays, you've heard some impression of what physical style is. He draws one distinction I would not. He distinguishes between board war games and science fiction war games. That's not really a distinction of the sort I mean. I mean, if you look at it, there's a map, and there are little cardboard counters, but it's still a board game. So let us start at the front end. And at the front end, we have what might be called folk games. Games like chess or Go. Now, saying chess is a folk game as though the rules have always been there is incorrect. If you go back to the medieval period, the queen was not a very powerful piece because she could only move a single square or two. On the other hand, there is a rule called en passant capture, which is sort of the last rule that most people quite understand. En passant capture was not accepted by all national chess federations until, roughly the American Civil War period. There were some countries you'd go to and it was an illegal move. Go is played on a 19 by 19 grid. Now you can find assertions in the literature that it was originally played on a 17 by 17 grid and then the grid was expanded. I tried pursuing this, and there are a group of people who have assembled a complete set of all known recorded Go games. It fits on a large CD. It's nicely compressed. And I noted that even the game from, I think it's about 700 AD, is on a 19 by 19. There are illustrations that show 17 by 17, but if you look hard, you realize the lines go out to the edges of the square table, and you might guess that, in fact, you were allowed to play on the table edge. But at some point, people noticed the pieces fall off the table. Those are folk games, and there are lots of them. There are Mancala-type games where you have a line of holes and you have beans. It was originally played with beans, and you scoop out the beans from a hole and you move around the circle with them, putting one down at a time in some pattern. Efforts to solve Mancala-type games historically have not been very successful, and as far as the last I heard, there were not happy AIs for them the way there are for chess. Then, sort of off to one side, there are athletic games, things with balls, soccer, whatever. These come and go in popularity. Before World War II, it was obvious what the great competitor for football was going to be in the United States, or baseball. The real professional sport was going to be horse polo. And in fact, there is near New York the Polo Grounds, which is actually big enough to play horse polo on. It's sort of 3 times the linear dimension of a football field. This is, of course, American horse polo played with a rubber ball and mallet rather than some of the Middle Eastern competitors where you use not a rubber ball, but the head of a goat. Or in one notorious case, the head of the former dictator of the country who had just been separated from it, much to his resistance. Okay, so let us advance and talk about strategy games. And if we go back, what started first, what started second, you can trace back a long distance, and the first traces of a start go back a long ways. But one might reasonably propose that what I will call miniatures, that is, games fought out with toy soldiers, go first. And you can trace them back to a set of rules by H.G. Wells on games with toy soldiers. And you can trace them back to Fletcher Pratt, who did a naval war game in the 30s. This is the same Wells who wrote War of the Worlds. And if you read that short novel, realizing that he did this, you can see points in the battle scenes where you can hear the dice clattering. Similarly, Fletcher Pratt did a naval war game in the 30s, and it used ship models or cardboard models. And you moved the ships. This is before the utility of aircraft to sink enemy ships was recognized. The Pratt rules are based on range guessing. That is, I have a battleship there, someone has a battleship at the far end of the room or even further away. I guess the range in inches, and having guessed the range in inches, there is then a procedure where we drop the first shot, and then the next further shots are walked in. I am reminded of a group in, I shall not name the city. It was a large group of people, and someone's friend showed up and played for a while, except the friend was in something like carpet installation. And the friend was the person who would walk into this room and be able to tell you in an instant the distance from this wall to that wall in inches and be off by 1 or 2. That's devastating in this rule set. There was also the good friend of mine, the naval wargamer, who had the minor objection to these rules. My glasses are this thick. I want a set of rules where I am playing the captain or the admiral, not the gunnery officer, thank you. But that is miniatures, games with toy soldiers. What do we get next? Well, there were other board war games that were somewhat strategic, but modern board wargaming was the creation of one man, Charles Roberts, who I never had the pleasure of meeting. Who in 1953 created Tactics, and then in 58 created Tactics 2, and having no idea where to advertise it, he advertised it in Scientific American, which is where I saw it. Of course, I was a bit younger then, just slightly. And the notion of serious board war games is that you have fairly extended rules, you have detailed representations of combat strengths, you have a combat resolution method which is more sophisticated than Dungeons & Dragons hit dice. And you then have rules for supply, command control, and other such features. So you have something that at least vaguely looks like real warfare. Roberts had the whole armies of 2 countries fighting it out, but you can also have board war games where individual unit counters represent individual men or women. That's Roberts. Sort of at the same time as Roberts, who gave us board war games, you also have light war games, which are board games, but where the rules are vastly simpler than they are of real war games. Something like Risk, or Stratego, or Memoir 44, which is a new one, relatively speaking. And these are games that also represent warfare, combat command, there's another one, that you also have strategy to some extent, but the rules are much, much simpler, and there is a real bifurcation in terms of degree of complexity. Okay, diplomatic games. And diplomatic games basically go to Calhammer's game, Diplomacy, which was also the late 50s. It is a game that represents Europe before World War I. There is a military component, but most of the game is based on player interactions, negotiating with people, trying to make arrangements. There are some people who will tell you it's based on deciding when to stab your allies in the back. But most of the truly successful diplomacy players I know, not all of them, but a good fraction of them, say their most important success is that they have never broken a treaty. And that was critical to what they did to be successful. So those are diplomatic games. Okay, so now what do we have? We have games based on bargaining. We have games based on detailed analysis. We have games based on some analysis and a certain amount of die rolling. Miniatures are really The key feature is its toy soldiers. Between here and there is no fundamental distinction, and in principle you could construct a board game which was exactly a miniature set of miniatures rules or vice versa. In fact, Game Designers Workshop, which was a major game company of the 70s, created System 7 Napoleonics. It's how we fight out Napoleonic battles. It is in all sense a set of miniatures rules, but there are no toy soldiers, there are little cardboard counters. And other than the fact they sell you the cardboard counters, it's a set of miniatures rules. So, was there anything else? Well, there was the very front end of what we would now call Euro games. Games like Puerto Rico, and the front end was a few games like Clue or Monopoly. Games where you had to think, but in which the size of the game, the duration of the game, and the topics were very different from board war games. And that brings us forward to, about 1960. And so I have now described all of these different physical styles of games, and I'll say more of them a little later on. However, I'm going to erase this. And I'm going to point out some more modern variations on this. And actually, the first of the modern variations to show up, arguably, were computer games. However, the history of computer games I am about to give you is a little different. Because we go back to the late 1950s, and there was the fellow at Bell Labs who had something that appeared to be Pong. And if you went to the Pittsburgh Museum of Natural Science, but no place else, they had a game-playing computer. Now, it was a hardwired computer, not a programmable computer. It was a relay-based computer, and the folks at Bell Labs who had built it for the museum used the biggest relays you could get commercially. And if you sat there, you could watch it do its computations because the relays had been slowed down. So clatter, 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 and gee, it's about a 1 hertz machine. No, maybe not even 1 hertz. But it played tic-tac-toe flawlessly. Then, if you advanced to, 1962, and MIT, there was a computer game called Space War. Space War was played on a PDP-1. You can see the computer in question in the Boston Computer Museum if you go there. The reason it was played on that computer was that MIT had so many computers that they had a computer on which students were allowed to do hardware projects and modify the operation of the machine physically. And someone had the clever idea of inventing what we would now call the joystick. In about '63, I actually played Space War using, I'm told it was the original joystick, but I wouldn't bet on that. That's Space War. But if you think about this, the PDP-1 cost $200,000 $1962. That's the equivalent of 100 automobiles, or about $2 million today. This is not something you had in your living room, ignoring the fact it was, yay tall and this deep and about as long as here to the wall. The machine was not exactly a home computer. However, something else was going on, and the something else that was going on, we're diverting a bit, is what we would call moderated games. Moderated games come in if you want reasonable simultaneous movement. Now, the real world has simultaneous movement. Everyone acts at the same time. And we will discuss various ways of faking this or generating it for board games. We'll do that in a future lecture. But the general notion, if you were wargamers in the period and you wanted a game with simultaneous movement, is that you wrote out your orders on pencil and paper, you handed it to a central moderator, the moderator executed all of the moves, and gave the results back to you. And the first commercial company to do this was Flying Buffalo Incorporated, and it was done by a fellow by the name of Rick Loomis. And I'm about to tell you why else it's important. And he invented a game called Battle Plan, which was a war of nations all around the real world. Battle Plan. And he had it set up for in 1970. It had been running it, paper moderated, for several years. And he wished he was able to play it himself. But he had this constraint. It was a hidden movement game. He wasn't supposed to know what anyone else was doing. And who would trust the moderator not to peek at the moves? And a friend of his remarked, well, you know, instead of you moderating the game, I could program a computer to do this. Remember, we are in 1970. This is a radical idea. And in 1972, this program having been written out in enough detail, Flying Buffalo Incorporated became, so far as is known, the first company in the world to purchase a computer, it was a semi-mainframe at that time, for the purpose of playing games. Not serious war games that you tell the Pentagon or the NKVD about. This was a computer that you played games the way all of you have played computers, but they were actually the first people to do it. So they were actually the very first computer gaming company. And they did this back in 1972. That's the next piece of computer games. By the way, they're still in business, and I gather you can still play Battle Plan if you want to. So there are computer games. Real computer games as we know it now mean that computers have to become cheap enough that everyone can afford to own one. We reach this a little further forward in time. And now we will go back a bit, and we will, or no, it's really ahead a bit. It's about 1973. And I was still at MIT as a grad student, and there was discussion, gee, we have what we thought of as the useful branches of the hobby. Miniatures, board war games, which at the bottom baby end included Risk, diplomatic games. If someone was clever, could they create another type of game? And what we didn't know is it had been done. There was a friend of mine, we'll get to the name in a second, who was extremely fond of medieval miniatures and had a group of friends of his who played medieval miniatures. And Gary Gygax had published a set of rules called Chainmail, which were a set of rules for fighting out normal late medieval battles with toy soldiers. They're late medieval. You have cannon. Not many, not any good, but cannon. And at some point along the way, the folks who were involved in this discovered a series of books by an extremely obscure, yes, we're still in the period when it was extremely obscure, English author by the name of John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, who at the time was very obscure, and yeah, if you might have heard of it because it was just starting to become of reading interest. And they decided they wanted to fight out all of these battles, use of the Tolkien books, and this meant you had to have rules for spells and rules for wandering monsters. And after a while, they also discovered a couple of other books, for example, Fritz Lieber, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, which is another series of fantasy novels, and they wrote a set of miniatures rules that let you do this. They were what were called skirmish rules, that is, one figure is one man, as opposed to large-scale battle rule miniatures. Each of those toy soldiers represents 20 or 50 or 1,000 men. And someone went off to Lake Geneva because the International Federation of Wargaming had an annual convention there. Yes, it's the same Lake Geneva convention, but it was a little smaller then. And they came back with this what was a very odd set of miniatures rules in this imitation plywood box. I still have it. And you looked at it, and it's miniatures rules. And after a bit, I read them rather carefully, and I wrote what was actually the defining article, though people didn't know it at the time. I said, no, Gary Gygax and Tim Arneson have not written a new set of miniatures rules. These are not basically miniatures rules. This is a new branch of the hobby. And there is a history which actually makes this point in much more detail. And the notion is you are in the game to play a character. Now, there was some discussion of this concept when we get to voice. We'll talk about it in more detail. And it is sometimes called the Rommel syndrome. And you have people who go into a board war game and try to ask, well, what would the real German commander have done? Or, I am the Emperor Napoleon, this is not Waterloo yet, and therefore I am invincible. And they would sort of talk as if they were Napoleon. But this was a little different. This was you were actually supposed to do this. And that's where role gaming came from. It was a set of miniatures rules. And role gaming was not invented, it was discovered. Because the people did not set out to do it, it was just dropped into their laps. Okay, so that's role gaming. Role-playing games. We have a few other things along the way. And the first one is, there's a fellow by the name of Garfield, Eugene Garfield. And he invented a board game. It's a nice board game. It's come out again recently. It's called Robo Rally. And Robo Rally is a very nice game, but it has one minor complication. If you are out to have it produced, and you look at the production costs of the components, they're significant. And so the folks he went to at first to have it produced, Wizards of the Coast, looked at it and said, well, that's very nice, but could you give us a game that we could produce for cheap to raise enough money to produce this other game? And he went back a bit and he gave them Money, the Gathering. No, that's not the name. Magic, the Addiction. Well, it's something like that, anyhow. There is an interview with Garfield in Contemporary Perspectives. He discusses all of the difficulties of producing a reasonable CCG and why we do not have a course on trying to develop one, namely difficult, challenging, huge required incubation time. He also explains why, because Magic was so successful, his other games since have not been nearly so successful. He also discusses why card games based on media, the Star Wars card game, the Star Trek card game, you can fill in the blank for yourself, intrinsically run into difficulties that did not come up for Magic, or did not come up for Pokemon, or did not come up for Yu-Gi-Oh! Namely, you have to be very careful how you do things, and if you put in more constraints, getting reasonable card sets that are well behaved just becomes hopeless. However, that is collectible card games. Now we are going to take a step backwards in time from all of these things, and we are going to return to the 1920s. And in the 1920s, there was a fad for what would be called parlor games. That is, because you now had things like vacuum cleaners and home appliances, people suddenly had, and almost washing machines, people suddenly had much more time on their hands, and they would sit around and entertain each other. This is before television. This is not before radio. There was radio. This is sort of, yes, people had Victrolas, though they also had player pianos, which there were once upon a time millions and millions. And the net result was, how do you entertain yourself? Well, you have a game for the evening, and you had live action role-playing. And the traditional live-action role-playing game in period was a detective game, because detective stories were very popular. You had Nick Carter dime novels, which everyone had read, the way almost all of you have read some number of science fiction novels. Who else here has ever heard of Nick Carter? Hands? How many of you have ever heard of dime novels? Well, some of you, a few of you. Oh, good. In any event, someone in the group was the murderer. There were clues scattered around the house. There were a bunch of people with part of the evidence, except they were also suspects. And they were all trying to find the real murderer so that they wouldn't get the chair instead of the guilty person. And so you had live action role-playing. And that's a very old part of the hobby. Since then, live action role-playing has bifurcated, and there are two parts. The part I just described is parlor role-playing, where we might all be playing this, and I would have a little tag on my sign here, and it says, Detective Holmes, but perhaps not as smart as the real one. And the other half of it is what we would call costumed role-playing. Costumed role-playing, the prominent piece is the Society for Creative Anachronism. And they get around, and to some extent it's there to recreate medieval battles, and you wear really good armor because it's actually moderately dangerous, and you wear very carefully padded, etc. weapons, and there are bunches of large numbers of referees around so that if people lose their temper, they're swatted down very quickly. And the net result is you recreate medieval battles. You can also recreate the medieval court, and there are large numbers of people who aren't interested in fighting, but are delighted to recreate medieval food, medieval tents, medieval entertainment. My suggestion of genetically engineered, you get the symptoms but not the fatal effect at the end, and it only lasts a week. Genetically engineered medieval diseases has not gone over very well with them, no matter how realistic it would be. Nonetheless, it's costumed recreation of period. And this is now so popular that you could read one set of science fiction novels set in the 40th century, and the heroine is an SCA member, except she's a 20th century SCA member and uses that antique weapon. I think it's a Glock. In any event, live action role-playing, the SCA medieval battles in terms of number of warm bodies engaged are on full medieval scale. Most medieval battles were very small, 5,000 or 10,000 people, and something like Pensic Wars actually gets that big. So you notice I have gone over a whole bunch of different sorts of games that involve strategy in some sense. And some of them are board tabletop games, and some of them are live action, and some of them involve computers and not. But there are all of these different sorts of games that somehow involve strategy and rules. So let us erase this. So, what we are here to do is to discuss what are called Euro games, tabletop strategy games that are not board war games. The reason I do not do board war games, A, there are no useful textbooks. B, creating a board war game I do not think could be done in our 7-week terms. I am discussing with IMGD creating a design of board war game course. I shall put in the numbers first. 500 level grad course, 14 weeks, worth a third of a unit, excuse me, a half a unit or more. How many of you would be interested in taking that at this point? Hands? Some of you. Some of you have already discovered you might. How many of you would be interested in taking it if it wasn't a promise that I would be teaching it? Well, any event, I guess that does say something about positive about my teaching. It is too difficult to do this. There aren't good books. Those of you who have been picking up books on computer game design to read, which is something you should be doing in your spare time, will occasionally encounter discussions of board war games. The most important thing to be said about those, since I went through a bunch of them before Tom and I wrote our 2 books, is most of them are completely wrong. I mean, really completely wrong. I'm not going to name any. I'm not going to hurt the feelings of any authors who sort of stuck this in as an aside and just didn't have the background to do it. However, we're going to be doing Euro games. And the question is, what characterizes a Euro game? It's not the theme, because there are Euro games like Memoir 44 that you do violence, warfare. What characterizes a Euro game is shape. Now, what do I mean by shape? Shape is what space in your life the game occupies. I don't mean shape of the box or the unit counters. Someone has tried to use hexagonal unit counters to go with the hexagonal spaces. What do we mean by shape? Well, shape is such things as duration of play, topic, complexity, appearance. In a certain sense, you would know, if once you understand what Euro games are about, you'll know one when you see one, and what you are seeing, what you are picking out to identify this is a Euro game, what you are identifying, say, we are doing a Euro game, is the shape. So what are the constraints that give us Euro games in general? The constraints that give us Euro games, which are almost entirely sold as you might guess, in Europe, come from how people raise children. It's a little different than what you might have thought. The result of this is the Euro game market is enormous relative to the market for games in the United States on the same topic. One can point at a title, I won't say what it is, which sold in the Netherlands something like 1 million copies. We are talking about a country that has a population of around 20 million. It sold about 1 million in the Dutch translation of a game that was already available in German, French, and English in a country in which most people your age would speak, in addition to Dutch, would also speak English, perhaps in addition French, perhaps more likely in addition German, because in Europe most people your age can speak 2, 3, 4 languages. However, it still had huge sales, and the sales in the Netherlands were not spectacular relative to the sales in Germany, France, England not so much. Huge market. So what are the constraints? The parents and grandparents, one or two of them typically, and the children, who are sort of 10 or 12, have dinner. The children do homework for a couple of hours, and then you play the game. And the requirement is that the game has to be finished before it's time for the children to go to bed. And the other requirement is the rules have to be simple enough that the grandparents can understand. Oh yes, if it's going to be fun for everyone has to be playing for the whole game. You notice in Puerto Rico there's no elimination of players, no one gets wiped out. That's a critical feature for everyone to enjoy the game. Because if there were player elimination, if players were wiped out, some people would still be playing, some people would have nothing to do, and that would be no good. Oh yes, you have to convince the parents who are playing this that this is important, and that playing games where you think is an important part of child raising. That is standard doctrine in continental Europe. People do not sit around and watch the moron box the way they do in large part in the United States. They, in large part, look at those sales numbers. 1 million copies means maybe 5 million or 4 million players. That's a large part of the total population. And so things like duration, 2 hours, give or take. Complexity, okay for the grandparents. Oh yes, no elimination, that's very fundamental. Until very recently, the topic restraint was no warfare. You have to remember that World War II was fought in Europe, and the European experience of warfare is very different from ours. Most of the cities in Germany were bombed to the ground and burned out. In fall 44 through April 45, the people in the Netherlands, they were besieged by Allied armies, and the Germans were still hanging on, ran on a 600-calorie-a-day diet for 6 months. There was also essentially no coal for heating. If you were in East Germany, when the Russians rolled through East Germany, the Russians hated the Germans, knew that Hitler had gotten in by claiming, we weren't really defeated. And the Russian method of persuading the Germans not to make this belief again was orders from Zhukov. It was done sub rosa. Every woman in Germany from 8 to 80 is to be raped on a regular basis. This was done. Any man who resists is to be kicked to death. This was regularly done. Anything in sight that you can pick up and move, like intact factories, is to be shipped back to Mother Russia. Warfare became extremely unpleasant for the Germans. And guess what? Until very recently, no warfare. Oh yes, appearance. This has to be playable by young children. Well, 7th, 5th grade. Something that looks pretty so you can imagine you're there. You've seen Puerto Rico, pretty counters, expensive bits, but you know, you're in a country that has lots of machine shops for making those things and machines to make them. Appearance is critical. We are almost out in time. Is there one simple question?
Just me, I noticed. In Puerto Rico, one thing I noticed, the duration that nobody's eliminated thing, is that people who look like they're winning might not near the end of the game. Like near the end of the game, somebody with like say lots of quarries or something might be able to build something crazy the last second instead of like steamrolling other players.
This is what Greg Kostikian calls dramatic tension. It's not obvious that you have lost until you have lost. In fact, that was today's discussion question. Kostikian proposes that dramatic tension is critical for a game. How does this correspond to you're playing a chess and you're playing chess and you're down a queen and a rook? Well, you've lost unless you're playing in the physics game. And the answer is that dramatic tension means everyone can keep up interest because perhaps life will change. We are now out of time. This has been the lecture mostly on physical styles of gaming. Class is dismissed.